Between Fire and Ice. Chapter 1, White-Hot Steel. I never thought my skin would be devoured by flames. 36 years of living in this world, I had seen death in dozens of its forms, bodies torn apart by shrapnel, severed limbs, frozen corpses in mine craters. But when I found myself in the burning belly of a Leopard tank amid the Afghan foothills, I realized for the first time, death is a palette, and fiery death is its most vivid color. However, at that moment, fate had not yet decided on the final hue for my demise. Dust, that damn dust everywhere. It ground between teeth like broken glass, crept under eyelids, turned optics into blurry smudges. War in the mountains is first and foremost a war against dust, I thought, driving my steel machine through a scorching gorge 30 kilometers from Kandahar. The temperature gauge in the combat compartment showed 50 degrees Celsius, and the sun hadn't even reached its zenith yet. The comlink suddenly came alive, Rivera's voice cutting through the silence. Movement, at 2 o'clock. His words cracked like a whip against taut nerves. Peering through the scope, I made out dark silhouettes through the thermal imager sliding between weathered rocks. 3, 4, and something else, long, thin, on one of the shadow's shoulder. RPG. My shout merged with the thunder of the shot, and time stretched like a drop of honey falling from a spoon. The rocket-propelled grenade traced an arc through the air, and I could see each of its tumbles, each degree of its trajectory. In my fractured consciousness flashed a thought that the angle was wrong, not enough energy to penetrate the armor. I was mistaken. The impact felt as if the earth itself had risen up and struck us from below. The tank shuddered like a living creature. Something cracked, hissed, and the cabin filled with smoke, black and acrid as death itself. Hydraulics, Tor's voice tried to overpower the wailing siren. Commander, we. The second shot didn't let him finish. It hit exactly the same spot and the armor gave way. Heat crashed down on me like a tsunami, scorching, relentless. Fire filled the combat compartment in seconds. What followed was a waking nightmare. The crew's screams, the crackling of flames, the smell, God, that smell of burning flesh and melting metal. I pounded against the commander's hatch like a bird against glass. Beat it with my hands, shoulders, head. Useless. I didn't immediately realize I was screaming. Not from pain, strangely, there was no pain, from terror. My body acted on pure instinct like a cornered animal. My hands found the emergency lever, the one they'd drilled us about during training but no one believed they'd ever have to use. Once, twice. On the third try, the hatch gave way. The air outside, hot and dry, felt like a cool breeze after the hell that reigned inside. I tumbled out, rolled down the armor. My coveralls were burning. Drop and roll. These words surfaced from somewhere in the depths of memory. I rolled across the rocky ground, feeling the fire reluctantly retreat. Gunshots, screams, whistling bullets, none of it mattered anymore. Consciousness mercifully left me, leading me into darkness where there was no pain, no fear, no feeling that I had betrayed my guys who remained in the tank. I regained consciousness in a military hospital in Germany. White walls, sterile smell, the beeping of machines counting my chances of returning to the world of the living, and pain such that each breath felt like climbing Everest. Burns covered 40% of my body. My face, by some twist of fate, was barely affected, saved by the ballistic mask, but everything else. "You were lucky, Major Reynolds," said the doctor, changing my bandages. His hands moved with the precision of a machine, his eyes not meeting mine. A few more seconds in that tank and we wouldn't be having this conversation. Lucky, what a strange word. I lay staring at the ceiling, thinking about Tors, about Rivera, about Morgan. They weren't lucky. They remained there in that burning steel tomb and they wouldn't be having any conversations with doctors. But I survived. And somehow I had to keep living with this pain, with this guilt, with these scars that would never fully heal. But that was just the beginning. In the following weeks, I discovered I couldn't stay in confined spaces. An elevator, a small room, even a car, all triggered attacks of suffocating panic. Military psychologists called it post-traumatic stress disorder. I called it my personal hell, where every closed door transformed into the hatch of a burning tank. When it became clear I wouldn't return to active duty, they offered me an administrative position at a training center. At least there I could step outside for fresh air at any moment. But I knew it wasn't right. I needed something completely opposite, something that would forever wash away the memory of fire. And then I remembered British Columbia, a land of eternal snow and endless mountain expanses, a place with no dust, no heat, no cramped offices, where I could start with a clean slate. I didn't yet know that this decision would lead me to a new war, not with enemies in the mountains, but with the betrayal of those I trusted most. And that one day I would have to choose between fire and ice, between vengeance and forgiveness, between who I was and who I could become. But all that was still ahead. For now, I just lay in the hospital ward, looking out the window at the falling snow and dreaming of cold, of saving pure, white cold that would freeze the memories and heal the burns in my soul. Chapter 2: Mountain Silence. Whistler greeted me with 30-degree frost and a blizzard cascading from the mountains like a silent waterfall. I stood in the tiny airport terminal, clutching my worn army backpack to my chest, the only thing I decided to take from my past life. I watched snow vortices dancing beyond the huge windows, an elegant, continuous dance, nothing like the Afghan storms. No dust, no heat, no ghosts of a burned crew that had haunted me for the past 10 months. In my pocket was a printout of an advertisement: profitable business for sale, snowmobile tour on wild trails, owner retiring. The price was laughable, clearly below market value. Exactly what I needed, not just a new place, but a new business that would keep my hands working and my mind thinking about something other than burning metal. Old Harlan received me in a tiny office that looked more like a cluttered den. The entire space was filled with route maps, snowmobile parts, and stacks of weathered wildlife magazines. He studied the scars on my hands, not hidden by sweater sleeves, for a long time, then raised his eyes, faded but still sharp. "So you're a tank man." It wasn't a question, but a statement. "What brought you to our parts? Usually, guys after service head for warm places." "Maybe because I've seen enough heat," I shrugged, feeling the scars on my back tight. No need to tell him about the nightmares where I burn alive again and again, about how I suffocate in my own apartment as if it suddenly transforms into a scorching steel box. The deal took less than an hour. Old Harlan seemed as eager to get rid of the business as I was to buy it. We shook hands, and by evening, I became the owner of a dozen used Arctic Cat snowmobiles and a small log cabin that served as an office, workshop, and my new home all at once. The first weeks blurred into endless fiddling with equipment. The snowmobiles were in much worse condition than they appeared at first inspection. I spent days in the garage, changing drive belts, adjusting carburetors, patching torn tracks. In a strange way, this work was calming. There was something meditative about disassembling and reassembling mechanisms, while the blizzard howled beyond the wooden walls, and the mountains stood around like ancient sentinels. Customers didn't appear right away, first individuals, then small groups. They liked the taciturn owner with scars. I gave the place a certain rugged authenticity, and I enjoyed teaching them to drive the machines, especially when we went into the mountains where there was nothing but white silence all the way to the horizon. There, among the endless snow fields, I finally felt free, as if the scars on my skin and in my soul were being covered with healing snow. Samantha burst into my life on a raw February morning, like a sudden avalanche. She entered my office in a bright blue down jacket, with a backpack full of instruments, and in a confident voice declared that she needed a snowmobile for an entire week. "I'm from the University of British Columbia Research Group," she extended her credentials. Her fingers were slender but strong, the hands of someone accustomed to field work. "I'm studying the impact of global warming on high-altitude glaciers. I need to reach several locations for measurements." Not giving you one alone, I shook my head. Safety rules. Then will you come with me? She smiled, and something in that smile made my heart skip its usual rhythm. You can tell me about the area too. This is my first time here for extended research. We spent a week together, traversing the snow-covered mountain slopes. Samantha was nothing like my idea of scientists, no dry academic demeanor. She laughed at my rare jokes, admired my ability to read animal tracks in the snow, and in the evenings, in the small research cabin, told me amazing things about mountain glaciers, about ancient ice preserving the secrets of millennia, about how the world changes with each cubic meter of melted ice. Do you know what lies beneath us? She would ask, tracing a slender finger across the map. Entire lakes of methane frozen millions of years ago. If they melt, it will change the entire climate of the planet. I looked at her, tousled chestnut hair, cheeks flushed from the cold, eyes burning with the passion of a discoverer, and understood that something was happening that I hadn't dared to hope for. For the first time since Afghanistan, something inside me was thawing, breaking through the icy crust I had built around my heart. Our first kiss happened in the Mountain Echo coffee shop, a small, cozy place in downtown Whistler. Snow swirled outside the window. Inside it smelled of fresh pastries and maple syrup. Samantha was talking about her research, waving her hands and constantly adjusting her thin-framed glasses that kept sliding down. And suddenly she stopped mid-sentence. "What?" I asked. "The way you're looking." "How?" "Like I'm some kind of wonder of the world." "Maybe you are." The words escaped on their own, and I leaned across the table and kissed her, simply and naturally, as if I'd been doing it all my life. The wedding, which took place 6 months later, seemed to gather all of Whistler. Even old Harlan came from his retirement home on the coast. There was laughter, music played, and the snow falling from the sky seemed like a blessing upon our union. And then he appeared, Professor David Lawrence, Samantha's academic advisor. Tall, distinguished, with perfectly styled silver hair and a smile that never reached his eyes. "My best student," he said, shaking my hand. There was some note in his voice that I couldn't identify then. "I hope you understand what a treasure you've acquired." I nodded, embracing Samantha's shoulders. I didn't notice how she tensed at the professor's appearance. Didn't catch the quick glance they exchanged. Didn't attach importance to how often she began mentioning Professor Lawrence in conversations afterward. Our life together flowed steadily and it seemed happily. During the day, I ran snowmobile tour. In the evenings, Samantha and I sat by the fireplace, making plans, dreaming of the future. Sometimes she left for field research, usually for a week or two. She returned tired but satisfied with a stack of data and samples. And then came the event that would change everything. An ordinary phone call on a frosty December morning. "Honey," Samantha's voice sounded excited. "Remember I mentioned an important expedition. We have a problem. Our driver is down with pneumonia, and we need to leave the day after tomorrow." I listened as she explained about the importance of the research, about grant deadlines, about how my experience driving a tank made me the ideal candidate for operating a tracked all-terrain vehicle in extreme conditions. I listened and agreed, not suspecting that this conversation was the beginning of a path to a new hell. A hell compared to which a burning tank in the mountains of Afghanistan would seem like a paradise. Chapter 3: Ice and Betrayal. The light was on behind Professor Lawrence's office door, always on, even in the deep hours of night when the other windows of the university building had long since plunged into darkness. I watched that window from the parking lot, sitting in my Jeep, watched the shadow moving inside, Samantha, my wife, at 2 in the morning, in her mentor's office. I shouldn't have been there. I should have been at our home, preparing equipment for tomorrow's expedition. But strange phone calls, half-truths, some elusive falseness in my wife's voice. All this led me here, to a secluded corner of the university parking lot, from where I could see the office on the 3rd floor. When she left the building, I started the car and drove away, not waiting for her to reach hers. I needed to get home before her, pretend I knew nothing. Not yet, just suspicions for now. Samantha returned an hour later. With flushed cheeks she explained away as caused by the frosty wind. I pretended to believe her. The next day at dawn, we loaded our things into my Jeep and headed to the research center where a Haglund-tracked vehicle awaited us. A squat orange machine designed for travel across the most difficult snow landscapes. Professor Lawrence appeared last when the sun had already cleared the mountain ridge. His movements were precise, measured. He was clearly no novice to such expeditions. A backpack full of instruments, a tablet with maps, and some unnatural, forced smile. Ready for a real adventure, he extended his hand to me. He smelled of expensive cologne, an inappropriate, alien scent amid the resinous aroma of the coniferous forest. I hope your tank skills won't be needed, although anything can happen in the mountains. Something in his tone made my combat instincts stir. The same instincts that had saved me so many times in the mountain provinces of Afghanistan. But I brushed off the warning signal. After all, this was just a scientific expedition. The all-terrain vehicle departed at exactly 8. I sat at the control levers, getting familiar with the machine. It was lighter than a tank, but the general principle remained the same: tracks are tracks. In the rear, in the living compartment, Samantha and the professor were arranging some equipment, speaking in hushed tones. The first hours of the journey passed in relative silence, broken only by the roar of the engine and the crunch of snow under the tracks. Occasionally, Lawrence approached the cabin, pointed out directions on the map, told me something about the route. There was a barely perceptible tension emanating from him, like the thin scent of ozone before a storm. By noon, we were already far beyond the range of mobile coverage. Endless snow fields stretched in all directions. No trees, no rocks, just snow and sky merging at the horizon into one blurred line. Beautiful, isn't it? Samantha sat down next to the driver's seat. Her eyes shone with a feverish gleam. It amazes me every time. Such absolute purity. It's mesmerizing. There's no one here but us for dozens of kilometers around. Yes, I glanced at the instruments. Just cold, -36 outside. Oh, that's still warm, she laughed, and something in that laugh seemed fake to me, like a poorly tuned instrument. Wait until we reach the station. She caught herself, and I again detected a note of alarm. When I turned to her, she had already moved back to the professor, who was rapidly typing something on his tablet. Day gave way to dusk, dusk to polar night. We continued moving, guided by GPS and instrument readings. I maintained a course strictly northeast, toward where, according to the coordinates, the Northern Star research station was located. Maybe we should stop for the night, I suggested when the clock showed 10 in the evening. I've been at the controls for 14 hours already. No, Lawrence responded too sharply. I mean, better to continue moving. 40 kilometers ahead there's a convenient spot for a camp, I know it well. Again that internal alarm signal like a distant bell. I looked in the rearview mirror. The professor was urgently whispering something to Samantha. She nodded, nervously biting her lip. We reached the campsite after midnight. A small depression, protected from the wind by snow drifts, as if specially created by nature for weary travelers. While I shut down the engine and checked the systems, Lawrence and Samantha quickly organized dinner. Canned food, hardtack, hot tea from a thermos. We ate in silence, each immersed in our own thoughts. I'll take the first watch, Lawrence volunteered when dinner was over. You rest. Tomorrow will be a hard day. I settled on my field cot, listening to the howl of the wind beyond the walls of the vehicle. Samantha lay beside me, but I could feel through my skin she wasn't asleep. Her breathing was too rapid, tense, like a hunted animal's. What's happening? I whispered. Everything's fine. Her whisper trembled like an autumn leaf. Just nervous about the important measurements. She turned to the wall, her whole demeanor indicating the conversation was over. I closed my eyes, but sleep wouldn't come. In my head swirled fragments of thoughts, strange coincidences, the inexplicable nervousness of my wife and the professor, their whispers behind my back. And beyond the vehicle's wall, the blizzard howled, indifferent to human fears and doubts. Somewhere out there in this snowy wasteland, the Northern Star station awaited us, and something told me what I would see there would change everything. Professor Lawrence sat in the cabin, peering into the darkness. His fingers restlessly tapped on the dashboard. The faint light from the GPS screen reflected in his glasses, giving them a sinister gleam. His hand kept touching his chest pocket, as if checking if something was still there. After all, he whispered to himself, accidents in the mountains are such a common occurrence, especially when they're carefully prepared. Isn't that right, Major? Chapter 4, Station of Deception. The Northern Star research station emerged from the snowy haze suddenly, like a ghost. At some point, the gray veil ahead took shape, dark, squat, nothing like what I had expected to see. This is a modern research station. Disbelief sounded in my voice like a false note. Before us stood a tilting wooden barracks, half buried under snow. The walls, blackened by time and winds, rested on rusted supports. Cracked glass darkened the narrow windows. Above the roof forlornly protruded a bent antenna, exactly like those I had seen in abandoned Soviet outposts in the Afghan mountains. Did we stray from the route? I turned to Samantha, but she averted her gaze, as if afraid to meet my eyes. No, Lawrence's voice sounded unexpectedly firm, like a hammer blow. This is exactly the station. Park the vehicle by the entrance. Inside the barracks, the air was stale and icy. It smelled of mold, rust, and something else, the special scent of abandonment that's unmistakable. The flashlight beam picked out ancient instruments from the darkness, covered with a thick layer of dust and frost, like archaeological finds. I slowly walked around the room, illuminating each corner. Here was a weather station, antiquated, with rusted dials. Here was a rack with some sensors on them. One could still make out faded Cyrillic inscriptions. All this equipment had clearly stood here for decades, knowing neither repair nor upgrade. I don't understand. I stopped at the central console, which had long shown no signs of life. In the documents you showed me, it talks about modern equipment, latest generation climate control systems, automated weather stations, spectrometers. Where is all this? Samantha and Lawrence were silent. In the silence, only the scraping of the wind could be heard, scratching the walls of the barracks with the claws of the blizzard. I pulled from my pocket a crumpled printout, a copy of the latest report on the station's equipment, which Samantha had accidentally left at home, and which I, obeying some intuition, had brought along. Here, I pointed to the lines, clear and merciless like a sentence. Installed last year, $3 million for equipment alone. Where is it? Marcus. Samantha took a step toward me, but Lawrence stopped her with a hand movement, firm and authoritative, like a conductor cutting off a wrong note. You are observant, Major, the professor smiled, but this smile resembled the grin of a skull. A military habit of noticing details, or just natural suspicion. What's going on here? I felt a familiar wave rising inside me, that special state of pre-combat readiness when all senses sharpen, and the body is ready for instant action. Science is happening, Major. Real science. Lawrence walked around the room, lovingly stroking the old instruments like a father proud of his children. Do you know how much it costs to maintain such a station? How much money is needed for real research? And those bureaucrats in Ottawa, they want reports, figures, pretty graphs. They don't care where the data comes from as long as the paperwork is in order. You're falsifying results. It wasn't a question. We're optimizing resources, he corrected me, and his voice took on condescending notes of a professor explaining a simple truth to a careless student. Yes, the equipment is old, but it works, and the difference in budget goes to real research, to what really matters, to what your offshore accounts. Samantha sobbed. I turned to her. She stood pressed against the wall and tears flowed down her cheeks, instantly freezing in the frosty air. "I'm sorry," she whispered, and this word hung between us like the last breath of a dying person. "I didn't want to. It all started so long ago." And then I understood everything, her frequent expeditions, Lawrence's strange hints at the wedding, those glances they exchanged. I felt sick, as if I was back in the burning tank, where the air was saturated with the smell of death. "How long?" My voice was foreign, as if belonging to someone else. "How many years have you?" 13, Lawrence answered for her, and something like pride sounded in his voice. Since her student days, she was a talented girl, in all senses. He said this with such condescending tenderness, such possessive intonation, that I was hit by a wave of pure, primal rage. I stepped forward, but Lawrence was quicker. In his hand appeared a pistol, small, neat, completely incongruous with the image of a scientist. "Don't get hot-headed, Major." The professor wearily sank into a creaking chair. "Sit down. Let's talk like adults, like business partners." I remained standing, arms folded across my chest. Samantha nervously fidgeted with the zipper on her parka, as if trying to hide in it completely. "Yes, we use old equipment," Lawrence spoke calmly, as if lecturing freshmen. "Yes, in reports we write about new equipment. The difference goes to support our research staff salaries. By the way, have you ever wondered why your wife can afford such expensive expedition suits? Or where you got the money for that snowmobile business, which you bought suspiciously cheaply?" I felt the ground slipping from under my feet, as if during an earthquake. Slowly turned to Samantha. "Is this true?" "Marcus, she faltered, as if hitting an invisible wall. "This money went to a good cause, for our future, for your business." "Which I thought was honestly earned." My voice sounded hollow, like an echo in a well. "Listen, Major." Lawrence rose, and his shadow cast by the flashlight stretched across the wall like a giant spider. "We're all doing our jobs here. Yes, not entirely legally. But was the war you served in legal? Weren't billions disappearing on military contracts there? We at least spend money on science." "On science," I laughed bitterly. "On rusty half-century-old instruments that don't even work." A heavy silence hung in the room. Only the wind howled in the cracks, and old wiring crackled, as if warning of an impending catastrophe. "What now?" I finally asked, feeling the adrenaline slowly receding, leaving emptiness and fatigue in its wake. "Now we'll finish our work here." Lawrence took out his tablet as if nothing had happened. "We'll complete reports, check equipment. By the way, we need your help. See this point on the map? There's a GPS beacon there, need to check its operation. It's not far, a couple of kilometers." "And if I refuse? If I decide to report this as soon as I return to coverage?" "You won't do that," Lawrence calmly replied, and his voice carried the absolute confidence of a man holding all the cards. "Because then Samantha will suffer too, and your business. You wouldn't betray your own wife, would you, Major? You do love her." I looked at the woman I once considered my better half. She stood with lowered eyes, as if unable to bear my gaze. At that moment, I didn't yet know that her betrayal was much deeper than it seemed. That between her and the professor was not just money, but years spent in his bed. This I would understand later, when I put all the puzzle pieces together. "Fine," I zipped up my parka. "Where's this beacon of yours?" "Right here," Lawrence showed a point on the map, "at the very edge of a glacier hanging over a mountain lake. Just go and check the signal. We'll prepare reports meanwhile." I stepped out into the polar night. Snow crunched under my feet, the wind lashed my face like an invisible whip. I walked forward, toward the indicated point, with each step more clearly understanding that I was walking straight into a trap. But something pushed me forward, perhaps hope that I was wrong, that Samantha couldn't be involved in an attempt to kill me, that somewhere deep in her soul she was still the girl I fell in love with. Behind my back, Lawrence was already taking a small package from his backpack, a timer and bricks of C4, which he planned to place under the thin ice where I was supposed to check the beacon. The first explosion was set to sound in 20 minutes. Chapter 5: Fight for Survival. I walked through the snow, feeling the frost creeping under my parka like icy fingers seeking my heart. -40, this isn't Afghan heat. Here, cold kills unhurriedly, methodically, almost with respect. First your extremities go numb, then comes deceptive warmth, and then I shook my head, pushing away these thoughts. Now I needed to think about something else, about how to survive. The GPS coordinates led me to a narrow ice ledge overhanging the dark water of a mountain lake. Something in its contours seemed wrong, as if contradicting the laws of nature, but I couldn't pinpoint what exactly. Military intuition, which had saved me so many times in the Hindu Kush mountains, now screamed of danger, but I continued walking forward. There was no choice. I had to understand the scale of the betrayal. A gust of wind carried some sound from the direction of the station. I turned around. In the ghostly light of the aurora borealis, I saw a dark figure rapidly moving along my tracks. Lawrence, and something in his hands. The first explosion caught me at the very edge of the glacier. The ice under my feet shuddered like a wounded animal, developing cracks, spreading like a web in all directions. The second explosion thundered almost immediately from the other side, cutting off the path to retreat. Now I understood the whole plan. He wasn't planning to simply shoot me. He wanted my body to never be found, for my death to look like an accident in the mountains. The crack in the ice shell grew with frightening speed, dividing the solid surface into separate fragments. The sound was like gunshots, the same dry crack, only multiplied by mountain echo. I rushed back, but it was too late. A huge part of the glacier I was standing on had already separated from the main mass and was sliding toward the dark water of the lake. "Farewell, Major." Lawrence's voice carried through the howling wind, distorted by distance and echo. "Nothing personal, just business. And don't worry about Samantha. I'll take care of her as I always have." I watched as the professor's dark figure dissolved in the snowy haze, like a last mirage in the desert. The ice slab beneath me continued sliding downward, toward the black water. I took out my compass. The needle confirmed my worst fears. The current in this lake was strong, and it was carrying me toward a waterfall, plunging from a 200-meter height into the valley. I spent the first hour trying to assess the situation. The ice floe was large enough, about 10 by 10 meters, but with each wave impact, new pieces broke off. In an hour, half of it might remain, or less. The radio in my pocket was silent. They had turned it off at the base. The GPS navigator showed that the shore was about a kilometer away. Under normal conditions, a trifle, but not when a strip of near-freezing water lies between you and land. The wind intensified. I took shelter behind a small ice hummock, trying to conserve heat. I knew I had only two possibilities. The first, to remain on the ice floe and slowly die from cold or be crushed in the waterfall. The second, to try to swim across this strip of black water. Both options seemed deadly, but the second at least offered a ghostly chance. It was at this moment that I heard a snort. 10 meters from me, at the edge of the ice floe, lay a seal. A large male, judging by the size, somehow carried by the current into this mountain lake. The animal curiously examined its strange companion in misfortune. A thought flashed in my head, insane, wild, but the only one possible in this situation. I remembered the stories of an old Inuit who once stopped by my snowmobile shop. Stories about an ancient survival method in icy water, a method their people learned from the marine beasts themselves. The knife slid into my hand like a living creature. I would have to act quickly. There would be no second chance. The seal was large and strong, but I had the advantage of surprise and the desperation of a man backed into a corner. and experience in hand-to-hand combat, albeit with entirely different opponents. The fight was short and brutal. When it was all over, I methodically set to work. My hands trembled from cold and self-disgust, but I couldn't afford a mistake. Each movement had to be precise, like a surgeon's. First, remove the parka and other clothing. Pack everything in a waterproof bag. Then, the hardest and most repulsive part. I began rubbing my body with the seal's fat, carefully covering every inch of skin. This fat, the only thing that could protect me from the deadly cold of the water. The cold hit me like a sledgehammer. The naked body covered with goosebumps, breathing became ragged, like a winded horse's. But there was no time to adjust. The ice floe continued to crumble, and ahead the roar of the waterfall could already be heard. I looked at the shore, a dark strip barely visible in the twilight. Somewhere there, beyond this strip of deadly cold water, was land, life, possibly justice. I attached the bag with my belongings to my back, making sure the knots were secure. Took a deep breath. Another one. Looked at the sky, where stars broke through thinning clouds. Thought of Samantha, not the one who betrayed me, but the one I fell in love with once in a small coffee shop that smelled of maple syrup and homemade cookies. And then I stepped into the water. The cold was absolute. It pierced my body like 1,000 ice daggers simultaneously plunging into every cell. For a moment, my lungs seemed squeezed in a vice, a reflexive reaction to shock. But the seal fat worked as a thin barrier between death and life. The thin film of animal fat created at least some protection from the killing cold. I swam, trying to maintain a steady pace. Each movement had to be efficient. Excess energy expenditure meant death. The water burned my face, the only part of my body I couldn't protect with fat. It instantly covered with an icy crust. But I continued swimming, as if part of me had already died and felt no pain. Time lost meaning. There was only the black water, burning cold, and the dark strip of shore ahead, which seemed never to get closer, no matter how much I swam. Sometimes I imagined strange images, as if huge shadows glided beneath me in the depths, watching my struggle with the elements. Or were these hallucinations from hypothermia? I don't remember reaching the shore. The last meters blurred into one smudged spot of pain and cold, as if someone had erased part of my memory. I only remember how my fingers scratched the frozen stone, how my body refused to obey, how consciousness gradually dimmed, like a burned-out light bulb. My last thought was, I survived again, like then in the burning tank. Fate had given me another chance. And then darkness fell. And in this darkness, I heard voices speaking in an unfamiliar language, resembling the song of the wind in the mountains, and felt warmth, the saving warmth of strange hands, pulling me from the cold embrace of death. Chapter 6. Among Strangers. Death smelled of mountain water and had a taste of salt. I was sure of this until I woke up and smelled something else: smoke. Not the acrid smoke of a fire, not the metallic stench of a burning tank, but something ancient, almost forgotten. The scent of cedar logs and herbs smoldering on coals. The smell of life. I opened my eyes. Above me was a ceiling of pelts stretched over wooden poles. A traditional dwelling of the Chimchian people. A tribe I had only seen in photographs in tourist brochures, but never thought I would find myself inside their home. The fire in the central hearth cast bizarre shadows on the walls. Somewhere outside, the wind howled, the same wind that had nearly killed me. Through the smoke hole in the roof, pale northern lights were visible, green and purple bands sliding across the black sky like ghostly serpents. I tried to move, and my body responded with a wave of pain, as if every muscle, every tendon wanted to remind me of that mad swim through the icy water. But I was alive. By some inexplicable miracle, alive. Ah, an involuntary groan escaped from my parched throat. Immediately a face appeared beside me, a young woman with almond-shaped eyes and 2 long black braids. She looked no more than 19. She leaned over me, said something in an unfamiliar language, melodic, with long vowels and soft consonants like the murmur of a mountain stream. When her cool palm touched my forehead, I realized that until this moment I had been burning with fever, balancing on the edge between life and death. Her touch was an anchor, holding me in reality, not allowing me to slip back into the abyss of unconsciousness. She brought a wooden bowl with some decoction to my lips. It smelled of herbs and roots and tasted bitter, but I drank greedily, as if it were the elixir of life itself. "Marcus," I croaked, pointing to myself. The girl smiled. Her smile transformed her face, making it look like the morning sun breaking through the fog. "Amber." Thus began my new life. A life without words, at least without understandable words. But the Chimchian people, as I later learned, had lived for centuries in a world where words meant less than actions. Here, on the edge of the known world, where temperatures drop to deadly levels, and the winter night lasts for months, only those who can read truth in another person's eyes survive. Later I learned how they found me. Hunters were returning with prey and noticed something dark on the shore. At first they thought a seal, but seals don't wear clothes and don't die from hypothermia. They brought me to the settlement, nearly dead, with frozen stiff clothes and skin covered in marine animal fat. The elders said it was a sign. A white man who used their ancient method of survival in icy water had to remain alive. They entrusted me to Amber, the daughter of a medicine man, who knew the secrets of healing herbs and ancient rituals, passed down from generation to generation since time immemorial. Days merged into one endless stream of recovery and learning. Amber changed bandages, rubbed my body with ointments that smelled of mountain herbs and pine, gave me decoctions, bitter but bringing relief. Gradually my strength returned, and I began to notice details of the settlement's life, so unlike anything I had known before. Everything here was different. No locked doors, the felt flap of a dwelling always open to guests. No secret deals, hunters honestly shared the catch with everyone. No lies, they simply made no sense here. How can you lie when your life depends on the trust of others, standing shoulder to shoulder against harsh nature? Every morning I watched as women hung skins out to dry, as men prepared weapons for hunting, as children played in the snow imitating adults. A simple life, unchanged for hundreds of years. And in this simplicity was such honesty, such purity, that it made my heart ache. I thought about Samantha and Lawrence, about their million-dollar schemes, about how easily they decided to kill a person for money, about that artificial world of false reports and falsified data they had built like a house of cards. Here, in the Chimchian settlement, it all seemed so petty, not even worthy of contempt. Amber seemed to understand me without words. When heavy thoughts overwhelmed me, she would simply sit beside me. Sometimes she sang, quiet songs in her language, resembling the whisper of mountain streams. Sometimes she just stayed silent, sorting herbs or working on a new pair of fur boots. She was beautiful with that special beauty not found on the pages of glossy magazines. Her movements were full of the natural grace of a predator, and in her eyes lived some ancient wisdom, inherited from hundreds of generations of women of her people. Beside her, I felt a strange peace, as if after a long storm I had finally entered a quiet harbor. One evening she brought me new clothes, fur pants and a jacket, sewn by her hands from the skins of animals hunted by the tribe's hunters. In every stitch was care, the very care I had so lacked in my past life. Helping me dress, she momentarily kept her hands on my shoulders. Our eyes met, and I saw in hers a reflection of the fire that was already burning in my soul, burning away memories of betrayal. That night we needed no common language. The language of the body proved more ancient than all human dialects. Her skin smelled of hearth smoke and mountain herbs. Her kisses were unskilled but sincere, like everything in this world where pretense and role-playing were impossible. Afterward, as we lay on fur pelts watching the stars through the smoke hole, I thought about the strangeness of fate. how it had led me through burning tanks in Afghanistan, through betrayal and icy hell, to bring me here, to this pure-souled girl, to these people, to this simple and honest life, as if all the trials were merely preparation for what was real. Amber placed her head on my chest and softly sang something. I didn't understand the words, but understood the meaning. Here, on the edge of the civilized world, where people don't lock doors and don't betray each other, where truth is valued above gold and love above power, I had finally found what I had sought all my life: peace. Ahead lay the road back to the station, to the traitors, to justice. But now I had a reason to return. Amber slept in my arms, and in the light of the dying hearth, I could see a slight smile on her lips. I didn't know then that this night would change not only my life, but the life of an entire tribe. I just lay there, listening to the howling wind outside, and for the first time in a long while felt not just a survivor, but truly alive. Chapter 7. Return to the Betrayers. Elder Wilson spread a map before me, a faded sheet with half-erased lines and inscriptions in English and French. The map probably remembered the days of the first European explorers, when scientific stations were rare islands of civilization in the wild land of eternal snows. "The journey is long," said Wilson through a young hunter who knew English. "4 changes of sun, maybe 5 if big snow comes." I examined the map, noting familiar landmarks. The station should be somewhere here, about 80 kilometers to the southeast. If the weather was favorable, on a dog sled one could reach it in 3 to 4 days. Lawrence and Samantha had likely already left, but that didn't matter. The main thing was to reach the radio and call for help, then deal with seeking justice. Amber stood aside, pretending to be busy gathering supplies, but I felt her gaze on my back. During the 3 weeks spent in the settlement, I had learned to read her like an open book. Now in her eyes was concern, not for herself, for me, and something else which I could not yet understand or didn't want to understand. The dogs impatiently pawed the ground, ready for the long journey, strong sled huskies, bred by generations of northern peoples for life in these harsh conditions. Their breath turned to clouds of vapor in the frosty air, their eyes burned with yellow fire. They sensed the approach of a great journey. "Dogs know the way," explained the young hunter, showing me how to control the team. "The main thing, trust them. They sense weather, sense danger. If they start to worry, it means predators or thin ice nearby. If they turn back, don't argue with them. They know better." I nodded, absorbing every word. My life now depended on this knowledge, the ancient wisdom of people who had survived for centuries in the harshest conditions on Earth. Funny how sometimes fate delivers lessons. To me, a former tank driver, now entrusting my life to a team of 6 dogs and a wooden sled. Just before departure, Amber brought me a small pouch made of deerskin. Inside were some herbs and roots. Their bitter smell reminded me of the first days in the Chimchian dwelling, when she nursed me back to health after the deadly swim across the icy lake. "Medicine," the hunter translated her words. "If you get sick from cold, brew and drink, helps." She wanted to say something else, but the words stuck in her throat like a fishbone. Instead, she simply pressed against my chest, small and fragile in her fur clothing. I embraced her, inhaling the familiar scent of smoke and herbs, memorizing it, as one memorizes a home before a long separation. Already sitting on the sled, I looked back at the settlement one last time. Amber stood at the entrance to her dwelling, her long braids flowing in the wind like black banners. She raised her hand in a farewell gesture, and something in this movement made my heart contract. At that moment, I didn't yet know one small secret of hers, which she hadn't had time or courage to reveal to me. "Huck," a short command, and the dogs lunged forward, drawing me into the white infinity. The first day of the journey passed relatively easily. The weather was clear, the dogs ran steadily, and dog team driving skills came surprisingly naturally. Perhaps my tank driving experience played a part, the same feeling of merging with the machine, the same need to read terrain several steps ahead. At stops, I would take out the map, check it against the compass given to me by the Chimchian. The main thing was not to lose course. In this white wasteland where the horizon is indistinguishable, it's easy to lose direction. One mistake could cost a life. By the evening of the second day, the weather began to deteriorate. The wind strengthened. The sky was covered with a gray veil, as if someone had thrown a dirty cover over a crystal dome. The dogs began to worry, looking around repeatedly, sniffing the air. I remembered the warning: if the dogs are anxious, something is wrong. I set up camp earlier than usual, constructing a shelter from the sled and snow. The dogs huddled in a tight circle, warming each other with their body heat. In the howling of the wind, I thought I heard voices, perhaps the ghosts of those who couldn't survive the mountain winter, or maybe just hallucinations of a tired mind. The morning of the third day brought a blizzard. Visibility dropped to a few meters. The wind threw stinging snow in my face as if trying to blind me. But I continued on. I knew that somewhere ahead, answers awaited me, and possibly a chance for justice. The Northern Star station appeared suddenly. At some point, a dark silhouette emerged through the snow veil like a ghost from the past. Everything was as I remembered: the tilting barracks, half buried in snow, the bent antenna on the roof. Only the tracks of the all-terrain vehicle had long been covered. Almost 4 weeks had passed since the day they tried to kill me. Inside it was cold and empty. Dust and frost covered the old instruments. The wind whistled in the gaps between the boards, like the sad spirit of this abandoned place. I methodically searched the premises until I found what I was looking for: the radio station. My heart beat faster. Now I could call for help, report what happened, escape from this icy hell. But when I turned on the power, the speaker responded only with the hiss of interference. The transmitter had been deliberately disabled, carefully and professionally. Lawrence had foreseen such a possibility, decided to play it safe. I cursed. Another plan ruined. And then through the hissing broke through a signal. It seemed the professor had broken the station only for transmission, but it still worked for reception. 3 short, 3 long, 3 short. SOS. The classic distress signal that everyone who has ever gone to sea or mountains knows. I pressed my ear to the receiver, listening to the coordinates. The signal came from the northwest, about 40 kilometers from here. And the source was very familiar to me: the same Haglund vehicle in which Samantha and Lawrence had fled. So, I whispered, taking out the map, caught in your own trap. They were stuck somewhere deep in a mountain gorge, unable to move further. Knowing their level of preparation for extreme conditions, they had at most a couple of days left before cold and hunger would do their work. I looked at the dogs. They had rested and were ready for a new dash. My flask still contained some of Amber's brew. The sled held supplies. I could just leave them there, let nature execute its justice. It would be fair, an eye for an eye. But then I remembered Amber's face, her kindness, and the wisdom of her people. Remembered how the Chimchian saved me, asking no questions, demanding nothing in return. In their world there was no place for vengeance, only mercy and justice, real justice, not its perverted form. Huck, I commanded the dogs, turning the team northwest. Somewhere out there in the snowy wasteland, the resolution of this story awaited me. I didn't know then what I would find in the stranded vehicle, didn't know what other betrayals would be revealed to me. I was simply doing what I had to do, as the Chimchian had taught me, as Amber had taught me. The dogs lunged forward, pulling the sled into the white void. A new storm was beginning, but this no longer frightened me. I knew, to find truth, sometimes you need to pass through a blizzard, and I had lived in lies for too long. Chapter 8: Realm of Frost. I found the Haglund vehicle toward the end of the second day of searching. It was stuck in a deep gorge, resembling a giant scar on the white face of the mountains. The orange paint of the machine had dulled under a layer of frost. The tracks were frozen solid in the ice. The dogs sensed it first. They began anxiously sniffing and pulling to the side. I stopped the team at a safe distance. Something in this picture was wrong, too quiet, as if death itself had already settled there inside the metal box. I took the binoculars, a gift from an old hunter of the tribe, from inside my jacket. The vehicle stood at an angle, tilted to one side, like a wounded beast that had tried to escape a trap and froze in its final effort. The tracks in the snow told of several attempts to break free, deep furrows from the tracks, scattered gravel, which is usually placed under wheels for better traction. But now all this had turned into a single monolith, seized by frost, like a museum exhibit. "Wait here," I told the dogs, though they weren't planning to run anywhere, clearly sensing danger. As I approached the vehicle, the picture became increasingly grim. The cabin windows were covered with a thick layer of ice from the inside, a bad sign. It meant there had been no heat inside for a long time. The exhaust pipe was clear of snow. They had tried to keep the engine running until until the fuel ran out or the battery failed. I knocked on the side door. Something stirred inside, a weak voice came through. "Help, please." Inside the Haglund, the air was so cold that breath instantly turned to ice crystals. My flashlight beam picked out two figures from the darkness. They sat pressed against each other under a pile of blankets and jackets. Samantha was shivering. Her lips had taken on a bluish tint. Her skin had become almost transparent, like thin ice. Lawrence looked not much better. His always perfectly styled silver hair had turned into a tangled mess, and in his eyes was fixed an animal fear, the same fear you experience when facing your own death. "God, Marcus," Samantha's voice was barely audible, like the rustle of fallen leaves. "Is it really you? We thought, we were sure that I was dead." I allowed bitterness to seep into my voice. "Sorry to disappoint." "Listen, Major." Lawrence tried to give his voice its usual professorial confidence, but it came out pathetic. "I understand you might be upset, even angry at us, but now is not the time for what, Professor? For truth." Something in my tone made them both fall silent. In the cramped space of the vehicle hung a silence, broken only by the howl of the wind outside and the tapping of ice particles on the metal cladding, as if some invisible presence was beating out a funeral rhythm. "How long have you been here?" I asked, examining the empty cans scattered across the floor. 11 days, whispered Samantha. Her voice broke, and suddenly it burst forth. "Marcus, forgive me for everything. I'm such a fool, such a blind, brainless idiot." Tears froze on her cheeks, turning into tiny ice crystals. "I didn't want your death, I swear. When you left to check that beacon, I didn't even know about the explosives. But you knew about everything else." My voice was quiet, almost gentle, and because of this it seemed even more frightening. "Why, yes," she sobbed. "About the money, about the fake reports, about what else, Samantha?" Lawrence jerked. "Don't." "Silence," I barked with such force that both of them flinched. The walls of the vehicle seemed to shudder from my voice. "I want to hear everything, now." And Samantha told me. About 13 years of connection with Lawrence, beginning while she was still at university. About how he charmed her, a young, ambitious student with his intellect and power. How he drew her into his schemes. How their scientific work turned into a money-laundering scheme, and research grants became a tool for personal enrichment. And all this time, I felt something cold and sharp growing inside me, like an icy blade. All these years of our marriage. "I loved you," she exclaimed with unexpected force. "Truly loved you, but I got confused." She tried to stand but cried out in pain. I noticed her feet swollen with black spots, clearly frostbitten. Without immediate help, she would lose them, if she hadn't already. "Major," Lawrence spoke up. In his tone appeared ingratiating notes which I had never heard before from this arrogant man. "I understand your feelings, but right now the main thing is to survive. You have dogs, you have supplies, we can." I laughed, and at this laugh both flinched again. "Do you really think that after everything?" Please, Samantha reached out to me like a drowning person grabbing at a straw. For the sake of what was between us, I know I don't deserve forgiveness, but if you leave us to die, how are you any better than him? She was shaking now not only from the cold, hysteria had set in. I looked at the woman I once loved and felt a strange emptiness inside. And then I remembered Amber, her kindness, her wisdom, her people who had saved me without asking questions. In her world, every life was sacred, even the life of an enemy. All right, I said finally. To the nearest settlement is about 3 days' journey, if we leave at dawn tomorrow. Thank you, Samantha exhaled. Thank you, I. Don't thank me yet, I cut her off. First, we have to survive this night. I settled the dogs in a relative shelter behind the vehicle, fed them the remnants of my supplies. Returning inside, I saw that Samantha was shaking more violently. If we don't warm her up, she won't survive till morning, said Lawrence matter-of-factly, as if talking about some laboratory specimen, not a woman he claimed to have loved for 13 years. Silently, I laid out my sleeping bag next to Samantha. She looked at me with disbelief and hope simultaneously. Just so you don't freeze, I said dryly, nothing more. The night dragged on endlessly. Samantha gradually warmed in my embrace, stopped shaking like a broken mechanism. Sometimes she sobbed in her sleep, murmured something about forgiveness and love. Lawrence sat opposite, leaning against the wall, pretending to doze, but I could feel his gaze on me, tenacious, assessing, waiting. I dozed off toward morning when the sky beyond the frozen windows began to gray, turning from black velvet to gray chiffon. I woke to a strange silence. The dogs weren't making noise. I sat up sharply, discovering Lawrence was no longer nearby. I rushed outside. The sled had disappeared along with the dog team. The old predator had calculated everything. He waited until I fell asleep, took my supplies and dogs, leaving Samantha and me to slowly die in the frozen vehicle. His tracks led to the southeast but quickly vanished in the rising blizzard, like fragments of dreams upon waking. Returning to the vehicle, I saw in Samantha's eyes despair mixed with understanding. She had realized everything without words. He left us, she whispered, like the last. She didn't finish. From outside came a strange sound, as if something heavy had hit metal. Then a guttural growl that made the hair stand on end, and a human scream piercing, full of primal terror. A grizzly. I knew they roamed these parts even in winter, sometimes waking from hibernation in search of food. I had seen their tracks yesterday but didn't pay attention. Now I understood. Lawrence had noticed them too. That's why he fled, hoping the predators would occupy themselves with the stuck vehicle while he escaped. The screams ceased as suddenly as they had begun, and an hour later the blizzard subsided a bit, and I was able to go out for reconnaissance. What I found half a kilometer to the southeast had once been Professor David Lawrence. Now it was just bloody traces in the snow, torn sleds, and scraps of clothing. The dogs had scattered, their tracks separated and disappeared in different directions. Intelligent animals, sensing the bear, they had broken their harnesses and escaped. People sometimes prove stupider than dogs, especially when they think they're smarter than everyone else. I collected what remained of the professor in a plastic bag, then returned to the vehicle where Samantha awaited me, and the realization that everything had to end here, but not as the traitors had planned. Differently, by my rules. I had one more chance. Explosives from the base lay in my backpack, if properly placed around the frozen tracks and under the undercarriage. Samantha silently watched as I prepared for the explosion. In her eyes was no longer any pleading or hope, only resignation and understanding of the inevitable. Understanding that whatever the outcome of this story, the past could never be recovered. I set the last charge, attaching it to the frozen joint of the track mechanism. I looked east, where the sun was rising behind the snowy curtain. Somewhere there was the Chimchian settlement and Amber with her secret, which I did not yet know. I began unwinding the fuse. It was time to end this story. Chapter 9. From the Ice Prison. The explosion thundered like a bolt from the blue. The ice around the vehicle cracked like a glass bowl under a hammer's blow. I was already in the cabin when the last echoes of the explosion dissolved in the mountain air. Key in the ignition, gas pedal to the floor. The engine didn't respond immediately. It coughed, spat out a cloud of blue smoke, then again, and again. On the fifth attempt, it finally came to life, hoarsely, laboriously, but alive. The tracks screeched over the broken ice like nails on glass. Slowly, painfully slowly, but the vehicle began to escape from its icy trap. Samantha lay in the rear of the vehicle, wrapped in all the blankets that could be found. Her feet. I tried not to think about her feet, about the black spots of frostbite, which meant only one thing: amputation. The main thing now was to reach civilization. The nearest settlement was about 150 kilometers away, 2, maybe 3 days' journey if the weather and equipment held up. The weather failed almost immediately. The storm caught us 4 hours after we started moving. The sky and earth merged into a single white vortex, as if someone had shaken a giant cocktail of snow and wind. Visibility dropped so much that I could barely make out the outline of my own hood. The GPS showed we were moving south, toward populated areas, but I was no longer sure if we could trust electronics in such conditions. "Forgive me," Samantha's voice barely penetrated through the roar of the engine and the howl of the wind. "Forgive me for everything." "We'll talk later," I cut her off. "I need to concentrate now." But she couldn't keep silent. Words poured from her like blood from an unhealing wound. "I really did love you at the beginning, genuinely. But then, it's like a drug, you know. Money, power, secret meetings. David knew which buttons to push. He knew how to make a person feel chosen. And then decided to get rid of you as soon as you became a burden." I peered into the white haze ahead, trying to make out any landmarks. "Left you to die in the all-terrain vehicle. A beautiful end to a romance, I must say." She sniffled. "You know what's the scariest part? I wasn't surprised. Somewhere deep inside, I always knew he was capable of this. I just didn't want to believe it. Didn't want to believe that I was the same." The fuel ran out at the end of the second day. We had managed to cover about 2/3 of the way to Calgary. The engine made one last convulsive gasp and died. In the ensuing silence, the howl of the storm was particularly distinct, the ancient song of northern winds. "Is that it?" asked Samantha, and in her voice sounded strange relief. "Is this the end?" I checked the radio for the 100th time. Through the interference, fragments of communications occasionally broke through, meaning we were already in the range of civilian frequencies. I began transmitting a distress signal, again and again, like a metronome beating the rhythm of our last hope. Help came after 20 hours. First, we heard the rumble of a helicopter, then saw glimpses of search lights through the snow curtain. Rescuers appeared as if from nowhere, in bright red suits, with medical equipment and thermoses of hot coffee. Samantha was taken first. Her feet could no longer be saved. Gangrene had set in. Urgent surgery was required. I watched as the helicopter rose into the sky, carrying away my past life, and felt a strange relief, as if I had dropped an unbearable burden. At the Calgary hospital, they were waiting for us. Not only doctors, agents of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police also showed interest in the story of the missing scientific expedition. They were especially interested in the documents I had taken from the base before setting out to search for the vehicle. Everything spun as if in accelerated filming. Interrogations, testimonies, examinations. The entire grant scheme was exposed, millions of dollars that disappeared into thin air. Fake reports about equipment that never existed, bribes to officials from the grant committee, intimidated graduate students forced to falsify data. The story made headlines. Ice fraud, scientific scam of the century, corruption among glaciologists. Newspapers shouted about the sensation. The University of British Columbia found itself at the center of a scandal that threatened to escalate into an international incident. Samantha lost both legs below the knee. The gangrene had progressed too far, the doctors could do nothing. When I came to her room, the only and last time, she didn't even turn her head. "I'm filing for divorce," I said, standing by the door, as if afraid to approach what remained of our marriage. "I know," her voice was lifeless like a desert. "Is it because of my betrayal, or have you found someone else?" "Both. Is she a good person?" "Better than you and I ever were." Samantha finally turned to me. There were no tears in her eyes, only endless fatigue and emptiness. "You know, now it seems to me, I would have been better off dying than in the vehicle. That would have been fair." I silently left the room. In my pocket were divorce papers and a ticket for a small private plane that would take me to populated areas near the Chimchian settlement, to Amber and her secret. But first, I needed to finish all the formalities. Give final testimony, sign papers, put an end to this story of lies and betrayal, which turned out to be longer and more complicated than I could have imagined. Leaving the hospital, I turned up my jacket collar against a gust of icy wind coming from the mountains. Somewhere there, beyond those peaks, a new life awaited me. Simple and honest, like the people who saved me from death. Like the girl who nursed me back to health and gave her heart, asking nothing in return. A snowfall was beginning, the first of the coming winter. White flakes slowly fell on the gray city, as if trying to cover its sins with a shroud of oblivion. But I knew some stains cannot be washed away even by mountain snow. I caught a taxi and gave the address of my lawyer. I needed to hurry. In 2 days, a plane would be waiting for me, and a new chapter of my life. Chapter 10. Return to the origins. The small otter aircraft trembled like a frightened bird, pushing through gusts of icy wind. The snow-covered mountain ridges below resembled frozen waves of eternity, a white canvas, crossed by black lines of cliffs and gorges. I sat with my forehead pressed against the cold window glass, thinking about how whimsically the thread of fate winds. A month ago, I was trudging through these mountains on foot, fighting for each breath. Now I was returning, no longer as a fugitive, but as a man who had found his true path. "I won't fly any further," shouted the pilot over the roar of the engine, bringing me out of my reverie. "See that ridge? Your friends are somewhere in that valley. If I'm not mistaken, they've long since spotted the plane." I nodded. During my time with the Chimchian, I had understood, for people who have lived by hunting for centuries, any sound, any movement in the sky does not go unnoticed. In their world, attention to detail is not just a habit, but a condition of survival. The plane landed on a relatively flat area among the fir trees. Snow swirled in vortices raised by the propeller. No sooner had I unloaded my backpack than dark figures appeared on the horizon, hunters on snowshoes. They emerged as if from nowhere, materialized from the white shroud, like spirits of these ancient mountains. They recognized me immediately. The young hunter, the same one who had taught me to drive a dog team, approached and embraced me firmly like a brother. Words were unnecessary. A pat on the shoulder, a smile, a nod toward the settlement. Welcome home. Amber was waiting at the entrance to her dwelling. She stood motionless like a young pine, only her long braids fluttered in the wind like ravens' wings. When I approached, she stepped forward and I saw the changes, a barely noticeable roundness of her stomach under her fur clothing, a special gleam in her eyes. And then I understood her secret. She knew about it already when I was leaving, and she knew that I would return no matter what. Our embrace was long, as if both feared the other might disappear, dissolve in the snowy haze. She smelled of hearth smoke, herbs, and something else, that special aroma of new life that was developing within her. I knelt, pressed my cheek to her stomach. I needed no words to express how much this meant to me, and she required no words to understand. The following days merged into one endless moment of happiness, as if time had lost its power over us. The settlement accepted me as one of their own, simply and naturally, without ceremonies or unnecessary questions. The elders blessed my union with Amber. The shaman conducted an ancient ritual, calling upon the mountain spirits to protect the unborn child. Life in the tribe flowed according to the eternal laws of nature, unchanged since time immemorial. Every morning the hunters left for the hunt. Women took care of the household, children played in the snow, imitating adults. I learned everything. How to track a moose by barely visible traces in the snow, how to predict weather by cloud formations and bird behavior, how to make tools from bone and stone, leaving nothing wasted. In the evenings, when the tribe gathered around the big fire, Amber taught me the language of her people. The words seemed unyielding, like frozen clay, but I stubbornly molded them into phrases. Each learned word became another small bridge between my past life and new reality, a bridge connecting two worlds that I once thought incompatible. Our son was born on the longest night of the year, when darkness seemed as if it would never yield to light. The birth was attended by an old medicine woman, the same one whose hands had helped bring 3 generations of the tribe into the world. When the first cry of the child sounded, the northern lights flared over the settlement. Emerald and purple flashes danced in the sky, as if welcoming the new person. I held my son in my arms and saw in his face features of both peoples, the almond-shaped eyes of his mother and my straight nose, the dark skin of the Chimchian and my light blonde hair, a living embodiment of the bridge between two worlds. "What shall we name him?" I asked Amber in her language. Over the past months, I had learned to speak enough to express what was most important. She smiled and pronounced a name, an ancient name of her people, meaning he who came with the first snow. I repeated it, feeling how it rested on my tongue, naturally and correctly, as if it had always been part of my being. On particularly cold nights, when the wind howled in the cracks of the dwelling like a hungry beast, I sometimes thought about my past, about the burning tank in the mountains of Afghanistan, about Samantha's betrayal, about the insane swim across the icy lake. Each trial, each wound, each loss, all led me here, to this woman, to this child, to this simple and honest life, devoid of falsehood. One morning I saw smoke in the distance. Somewhere another scientific expedition was passing through, perhaps again with false reports and stolen millions. But now this was not my concern, not my cross to bear. My world had narrowed to the boundaries of the settlement, to the warmth of our dwelling, to the smile of my son and the embraces of Amber. And in this small world was more meaning than in all scientific grants and military contracts. In spring, when the sun finally conquered the long darkness of the polar night, my son and I sat on a ledge of rock near the settlement. The little one played with a bone figurine of a wolf, which I had carved for him with my own hands, while I looked east, where the horizon merged with the clear morning sky. "There's a big world out there, son," I said in English, though the child didn't yet understand words in any language. "A complex, tangled, often cruel world. Someday you'll learn about it, but here is our real home." Amber called us for breakfast. I took my son in my arms and walked to the dwelling where the hearth burned and the woman who had given me a new life waited, a life in which fire warms, not burns, and ice doesn't kill but preserves. Behind remained our footprints in the snow, large and tiny, intertwining like our destinies. And over the mountains, a new morning was dawning, indifferent to human dramas, eternal as the cliffs themselves. In its light, the future seemed as pure and promising as the untouched snow around the settlement, waiting for new tracks, new stories, new beginnings.